And we're live. It is Friday, April 4th, the year of our Lord 2025. It is 8:00 a.m. and this show is all about me. I mean, yeah, there are other people on the screen, on your screen right now, but they don't have existences autonomous from my interactions with them. They all exist only as sounding boards for my experience. The protagonist of the narrative is always me. And and so we're going to talk
Honestly, no lies detected.
we're going to talk about me here, and they're just here as sort of the color of the wallpaper and the things that I, the protagonist, interact with. For example, this is the moment where I call upon the cactus to do the thing that the cactus always does in interaction with me at the beginning of the show. Cactus? You are watching Dog Shirt TV, and notice that the sentence there, the protagonist, the subject was you, but since Dog Shirt TV is, among other things, me, that sentence is really you're watching me. So I'm the object of the sentence only by way of being the center of attention, and that is one of the revolutionary features of the show. And another revolutionary feature of the show is that I didn't tell any of my co-hosts or the guest that I was going to do this monologue. And so they are all as surprised by my rampant narcissism as you are. And still another revolutionary feature of the show is that, I know when to stop. And so I am going to turn this portion over to the show right now to sidekick Alicia, who is merely a representation of the part of my will that wants the guest introduced, is going to do that. We
It's
are
the
not
part of your will that actually gets guests for you.
we are not allowed to have fun anymore, but boy, we are allowed to impersonate narcissists, and it's hard.
I mean, I'm bewildered because Ben, and he doesn't want the world to know it, but is actually really helpful and giving and kind to other people, which, I mean, with my limited knowledge about narcissists, doesn't sound like a classic narcissist.
I regret to agree.
Right. We have today somebody who is an expert in the narcissists in our lives, the ones that we unfortunately marry or go to work for or encounter. This is Dr. Amy Brunell. She is with Ohio State University, and she's come to share her knowledge. I would like to, first of all, welcome you, Amy. And my first question that I'm going to throw at you is, what is a narcissist?
Well, great question. I don't think we need any help because we had such a wonderful introduction to it. So I'm going to talk about this from the lens of personality traits because it gets pretty complicated if we talk about it from a clinical psychology lens, although you can ask me some questions I might not know the answers to. But anyway, the basic idea behind narcissism, because it gets pretty complex, is that they're self-serving, they're entitled, and they basically don't care about other people. They feel superior. And so there's different kinds of narcissists, but those are the kinds of things that tie them all together, even when they seem like each kind is so different from one another.
Is it possible? I'm skipping ahead. I'm really sorry to do this, but is it possible for a narcissist to change and not be a narcissist?
Okay, so I know I was expecting that question later. Yeah. Well, okay. So I'm going to say, as with most personality traits, it's very hard to change by intention, right? So if you're somebody who's really shy, to say, okay, we're going to make you into an extrovert, is really hard. But just like that, situation, you can help an introverted person come out of their shell. So is it possible for a narcissist to change? First, the narcissist has to realize they have a problem, which, is difficult for them to acknowledge. And the other is whether or not they're willing to change. They're going to go to therapy. If they are, then yes, I would say that there's potential for somebody who's narcissistic to become less narcissistic. It's just there's so many barriers in the way, right? A shy person knows that they're shy and, sees it sometimes as a barrier, so they want to overcome it. But a narcissist typically is like, I'm awesome. Why do I want to change? So to get them to, recognize that they have problems and that they need to change is where some of the original problem comes from.
That was my next question. Do narcissists even know that they're narcissists?
Yes. I mean, that's one of the things that is so fascinating to me is all this research. So a while ago, our field basically said, narcissists don't realize that they're narcissistic, but there's been some really clever research done that shows that they do know that they're narcissistic. They simply think it's your problem, not their problem. So,
Well, and
yeah.
it often is.
Right. It often is. So they see their characteristics as, kind of positive, like, hey, I can self-promote, so everyone can see the good things I'm doing or how awesome I am. So they're not turned off by that, even though we might be turned off by it. But yes, the research has basically shown that narcissists know that the way they feel about themselves is not how other people feel about them. They're aware of their reputations.
All right, so I want to go back to the word. The narcissist is named for Narcissus, who stared at his face in the water because he was so full of self-love and self-regard. And I believe he either fell in and drowned or was turned into the Narcissus plant. I can't remember how the gods punished him. The word implies self-love, but I think the clinical condition is more about self-obsession. So I'm curious for the relationship between the word and the condition. What are we really saying about somebody when we say that they're a narcissist?
Okay, so going back to that Greek myth, one of my favorite parts about the myth that people forget is that there was a woman who was in love with him. And the way that he treated her is, pretty paramount to how narcissists behave with other people. He was so obsessed with himself, right, that he completely shoved her aside. And yes, we do have a beautiful flower that, came from it. Can you repeat that question? I kind of got distracted on the myth.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, what are we really saying about somebody when we say they're a narcissist? Are we saying that they're in love with themselves, or are we merely saying that they can't think about anything other than themselves?
Yeah, I guess I don't necessarily believe that it's self-love. It is more of a sense of superiority and entitlement. Thinking that you're better than somebody else. I guess they want admiration from other people. That's really key, is that they want to be admired. And I haven't really thought about it in this way before, but they're looking for admiration from other people and validation. And if they had this self-love, then I guess they wouldn't necessarily be looking from it. They need all this external validation. And somebody who loves themselves probably doesn't necessarily need it. So when you started this morning, you talked about how we all exist for you, and that's basically, the way that they operate. But they need it, right? They need that attention, they need that admiration, they need that validation. So I suppose that I don't necessarily view that as synonymous with self-love. And also, there's a difference between narcissism and self-esteem. So there's nothing wrong with having high self-esteem. In fact, we'd probably want people to feel good about themselves. The key difference is, do I feel good about myself versus do I feel better than everyone else?
It's a superiority.
It is the superiority.
What
and
if
that's
you
where
are superior, though? No, but I'm just that's a joke, obviously, but there's some truth in that. I mean, we're all a little bit narcissistic, right? We all are a little, not everybody, but I mean, we're all self-centered, right? We're all self-centered. We all think about ourselves probably too much. We can all be, and sometimes we are superior to other people. I mean, honestly, Ben is, I mean, very superior, I feel like. So I'm wondering, is it kind of a
Correct.
spectrum, and at what point does it become sort of pathological versus just human nature? And then my other question, sort of relatedly, is I'm just really confused about the difference between narcissism and sociopathy because there seems to be some overlap there.
Okay, so I'm going to be a little bit careful, and because some of your questions are better answered by somebody who is a therapist, a clinical psychologist, and I am not, but I will do my best here. So I study narcissism as a trait, which means that we all have a little bit of narcissism. And because I'm measuring it on a continuum, I'm basically putting every single person on a continuum. So I know that Ben is high, right, on this continuum. And maybe other people are lower on this continuum. I mean, that's basically how I'm doing my research, right? Is I'm putting everyone somewhere on the continuum, and then I'm assessing usually something else at the same time, such as their behavior. So this is a little different than how a clinical psychologist would approach narcissism. So if you have narcissistic personality disorder, they are using a manual, and they're looking to see, to what extent are you meeting the criteria for a diagnosis. So what is truly pathological in terms of narcissism requires a mental health professional to diagnose. And it is about 6% of our general population that is assumed to be diagnosed with clinical narcissism. I don't have a cutoff in my research, right? I'm just comparing people who are higher on this continuum, on this personality trait versus people who are lower. So some of my participants could certainly have narcissistic personality disorder, but I'm not trying to diagnose that in my studies.
Amy, actually, why don't we talk a little bit about some of your current research?
Okay.
Maybe that will also help frame some of our following questions.
Okay. In general?
Yeah. In general.
Okay. Well, so one of the things that I'm really interested in, or at least interested in right now, is what people think they are like and then what they're actually like. So I do a lot of research with a colleague who is a clinical psychologist, and she looks at decision making. And we've done work together looking at risky decision making. And so we have research that shows that narcissists will self-report that they're really like risk taking, right? They like to get those highs from, say gambling and skydiving or what have you. But when we put them in these situations where we're testing like how much risk they're willing to take, and I don't mean like physical risks in our lab, right? We're putting them in like mock gambling situations, or maybe they're in a competition with somebody else that's usually a computer, and we want to see, to what extent are they going to engage in a more risky way on these tasks. And maybe a little bit more, but not really that differently. So, I mean, that's one of those things that I'm so intrigued by is, they say that they do all of these things, but, what does the behavior actually show? Another thing that I find really interesting with a discrepancy like that, there's all this reports about, they'll report that they steal other people's romantic partners. And so I did a study where I set them up to see, would they be more attracted to someone in a relationship than somebody who's not in a relationship? No. So my conclusion from my research is they simply don't care if the person they're interested in is in a relationship or not, but not necessarily because they want to steal a partner from somebody else. I thought, since they play these kinds of games with their relationship partners, I did think maybe it was intentional, right? I get to win this game. I'm going to steal a partner from someone else, or this person's really attractive, right? And so they're better, and so I want them. But we didn't find evidence that they were more interested in someone in a relationship than somebody who wasn't.
Is there like a baseline for average people's self-awareness? Like, are they are narcissists more or less self-aware than average people, or were we just all having these kinds of lack of awareness?
Well, I'm more aware of awareness as a moment to moment thing. Like right now, you have me on a camera, so I'm very self aware. But the second that we're off here and like I'm in my office here alone, then I'll lose self awareness. And so, I mean, can narcissists tell how other people are responding to them? I don't think that. I think they can. If I were really narcissistic and I was here on the screen, I would be able to tell how you're responding to me. So I don't believe that they completely lack self-awareness. But I guess I view it more as a dismissiveness.
I want to ask about the relationship between narcissists and drama. We have this perception that narcissists are highly dramatic people who kind of spin out very self-centered, narratives, conspiracies, but that they're always looking for a storyline in which they play some very important role. Is that a myth, or is that an inevitable feature of wanting everything to be about me and wanting things to sort of revolve around yourself?
Okay, so there's a lot to that question. You might have to remind me of some of it, but I will say that there's the self-serving bias, which is basically when, things are going well, I take credit, and when things aren't going well, then I blame somebody else, right? And so there is a link between narcissism and this self-serving bias. In other words, when I'm successful, it's all about me. I was wonderful, I'm awesome, I rock. But I will easily find somebody else or the situation to blame when things didn't go my way. So, it didn't go my way because you're an idiot or they're out to get me. So there is some link between narcissism and this perceived victimhood because of that. So I think I completely answered your question,
Yeah,
maybe, but
I think so.
okay.
But there's this added element of drama when we think of narcissists. And, it's not just blame shifting and taking credit. It's also that there's chronically a story that they need to be telling about themselves. And I'm wondering, how does that quality fit in?
I think a lot of it is that looking for admiration. More than anything else, they want to be admired and they want people to respect them, to look up to them. In terms of drama, I don't know that they necessarily, I guess when I think of like a drama queen, I don't necessarily think of somebody who's narcissistic. I can think of somebody who's narcissistic. But I want to say rather than creating, like they create drama through their interpersonal interactions because they're toxic, for example. They don't give credit where it's due. I mean, imagine a narcissistic boss. When my team's successful, it's all me, and when my team's not successful, I throw other people under the bus, right? So I want to be somebody who is recognized for all the good that I'm doing. I want everyone to give me the respect, that I'm due, right? Because they're entitled and they think they're better than everyone else. In terms of drama, they create drama because they create conflict. There's some research now showing that basically by nature, narcissists are fairly aggressive. So they're definitely aggressive if there's an ego threat of some kind, and this can be a minor ego threat. But they tend to be a little bit aggressive even in the absence of that kind of ego threat. So in terms of creating drama, I think that might be the key here is, that their toxicity and their aggressiveness and the need for attention and admiration kind of come together in this nice cocktail.
I was raised in white evangelical culture, and I read a book by a psychologist who's also from that culture, who on white evangelicals, and he posited that white evangelicalism was a collectively narcissistic culture. And a big portion of that was the victimhood piece that you were talking about before, but also creating this sort of grand narrative in which, our people, our kind, are the sort of the heroes of the day, the stars of the show, and then all of the evil is out there, like with other people. And that really resonated with me. He's a clinical psychologist, so I don't know what you think of the idea of a collective narcissism in a culture or maybe a country or a political movement.
So there are researchers that study collective narcissism. And so to be fair, it's not something that I have directly studied. But basically, yes, it's basically at this grander level, right, where my group is superior, my group is entitled, right? And probably because of that, I'm less empathetic to people who are not in my group. So there's quite a bit of research on that, and it makes sense that we would, view it that way. And I know that the researcher who I don't want to say like she basically figured this out and learned how to assess it. And she does talk a little bit about how it's different from nationalism. But I don't want to get too far down that road because I'm not an expert in her work.
What is her name? I'm just curious.
I'm going to have to circle back to that.
All right, I'll get back to you. Sorry to get you off your field. I'm really sorry about
that. No, you're okay. I'm just afraid of butchering her name on, television. So it's not an easy to say name.
It's a revolution in morning television, and that means that sometimes we butcher people's names and we do it without apology.
And sometimes we use the guest to get free therapy, even though they're not really qualified to do the thing that we need them to do. So.
Is that what's going on here? Because I'll start looking for entirely different guests if that's what you need.
Yeah, I even have another question related to my own experience, but I will shut up because I don't want to be a narcissist.
Holly, by all means.
Oh, okay. Well, fine. You guys feed my narcissism regularly. So the other related question is, so I was also raised by missionaries, and I'm wondering, and then there's a great Taylor Swift line in her song Antihero that references altruistic narcissism. And I actually have tried to look that. I can't find anything much on this, so I don't know if Taylor Swift kind of just made this up. But I was like, when I heard the lyric, I was like, yes.
So what you're looking for is communal narcissism. And I know like they're so similar, collective narcissism, communal narcissism. So collective narcissism is about more of this group level narcissism, like you said earlier. Communal narcissism is that I think I'm great because I'm altruistic. I think I'm great because I'm, going to save the world, going to be the best friend somebody could ever have. So this like inflation is in all these positive ways. And I don't know that we have, so this is a blast in research in this topic, but I don't know that we necessarily have all the answers, right? Because when we're talking about this agentic form of narcissism, which is basically narcissists, the way that we've been talking about narcissism all along, it's been studied now since the 80s, but communal narcissism, like when that got sort of figured out, it's been less than 10 years. So we have, lots to learn about it. One of the things I find really interesting about communal narcissism is that they're still power hungry. They're still looking for admiration and attention. They might do it in more of these helpful ways, but at the end of the day, that's basically what it's about. And then one of the reasons we know that, there's some research out there where if you empower somebody who is communal narcissistic, they actually become less helpful. So like this sense of empowerment stems right into this sense that I'm going to be the most helpful person in my community. So yeah, you're Taylor Swift and you are onto something.
I'm curious why narcissists, at least in my experience, talk compulsively.
Do they?
And, like they can be hard to get to shut up. And I'm curious if that's an endemic feature or if it's a or if it's not, just related to the subset that I've dealt with in my life.
So, yeah, I guess I do agree that I think of narcissistic people as being more likely to want to, to have the microphone and to talk longer and to get more attention. And that's what I think it's about. I think it's about attention, right? The crowd needs to be really large. I can think of scientists that talk that way too, that when they're presenting their research, they want to make sure there's a lot of people in the room. Which, you don't want to present your research to one person. I have to admit, I'm on the shyer side. But like a
I don't know.
narcissistic.
I gave a talk at let's just say a very elite university recently, and I brought in 4 people to give this talk with me, and there were like 15 people there in the audience, and it was great. We had a
Right,
really good conversation. But
right.
if you measured it from an ego point of view, not so great.
Exactly. Okay. So I love talking in small groups, right? So that's my jam. My class sizes tend to be on the smaller side, and I love it. Just like you're saying, best classes for me are classes where there's 15, 20 people. But classes that have 2 people, they're not as much fun. Right. And so if you want to be able to engage in this great level of dialogue when, it's you and one other or 2 other people, it's not necessarily the best environment if you're presenting research, right? I'm not just talking about conversation, because if I'm choosing conversations, my conversations tend to be one-on-one or, I told you I'm shy, so I don't like these big group things. A narcissist, though, what I mean, though, is that they wouldn't be satisfied with your group of 15, even if it was a great dialogue. They want 100 people there or 1,000 people there. They want this huge auditorium to be filled, and they want everyone to be listening to them for a really long period of time. So going, over their time. I'm thinking about conferences too, since that's kind of what you have me thinking about. It's disappointing if like I'm presenting and there's one person that came to see me present. I'm perfectly happy with 15 people being there. I don't score extremely high on narcissism. So yes, I do think that they want the attention and to have the microphone, definitely.
I'd be happy with the one person, and the 2 people, one person in class is pretty much my undergraduate degree.
So most of us cancel classes if there's only one person enrolled. So, but in terms of my personal life, I mean, like I said, I spend most of my time with friends one-on-one, or maybe, 2 or 3 of us, but not in these big groups. Lots of people do really well in big groups. That doesn't make them a narcissist. That makes them more extroverted. But there is a overlap between extroversion for some kinds of narcissists. You were about to say something.
So what happens
Ben,
if you put 2 narcissists in the same room and leave them there? Do they? I mean, it seems like,
cancel each other out.
well, you
It's like
could
2
get this
negatives.
situation where there's
No, I
just
know of a
not
marriage this
room
way.
for 2 people who don't recognize the autonomous existences of others. How does that work? What happens when narcissists meet up? Is it like matter and they repel? Do they attract? What happens?
Oh, goodness. So first we're going to have to start about whether or not they agree or disagree. Because I mean, it's sort of like fight to the death if they disagree and don't like each other. But you actually see couples where one narcissist is in a relationship with another narcissist. And I basically say that kind of has like the power couple vibe to it. So the extent to which, they're giving each other admiration, they're getting admiration as a couple from others, right? Then this is working really well for them.
Yeah, it
So
can work really well. That's all I'm going to say. It can work very, very well.
Can narcissists give admiration? Do they?
So narcissists are looking for a trophy partner. And so I guess in a sense, I mean, they're using their partners as like an object, but sure, they decided like this is the best person, or at least the best person right now, and I'll trade up, right? But right now, this is the best person. And if
Completely. Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
No, I said completely hypothetically, like just pulling this out of thin air and have no experience with this at all. I find if they're both invested in the same sort of goals or like, and they're both sort of communally narcissist in that way, then and then their narcissism feeds off each other. They're united in towards they're like what's giving them greatness. They're working together, but then also they're collectively great and they create kind of a mini ecosystem of narcissism where, their greatness feeds into each other and is indistinguishable and can be very successful marriage, very successful.
But you wouldn't know.
But this is just something that I hear. Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I've seen the show, but House of Cards comes to mind when I think about these kinds of narcissists coming together, to be the power couple. And I do get a sense, at least I don't know that I finished this complete series, but I got a sense that they do care about each other, but they also don't care about each other, right? Like they use each other to get their goals met. But not necessarily love, but that could have changed over time from what in the series could have changed over time for what I saw last. But I saw them cheating on each other, those kinds of things. So and which is pretty typical of narcissism also.
So
You don't make it sound very attractive.
I make it sound attractive, or I don't make it.
You don't make it sound very attractive. I mean, so here's my question. If you're describing a spectrum on which we all fit at some level, and I know from a clinical point of view, you would say it becomes pathological at whatever point along that spectrum it starts interfering seriously with your life and relationships. But from your point of view, in a non-clinical sense, where should we think of it as a problem, and where should we think of it as one of any number of character traits that, might be less lovable about somebody?
Interesting. So first of all, you said that they're not attractive, but we do think they're attractive, at least in the beginning. So think about somebody who's giving you lots of positive attention, like the term I've been hearing now is love bombing, right? It feels really good. You're getting all this attention. This person's really fun, right? And so, narcissists are pretty good at initiating relationships. And I want to say that it's sort of over time where their reputations sour because we get to see their true colors. So in terms of whether or not they're attractive, I want to say initially, like they're really charming and we like that. And that is also what gets in our way in our own relationships, is that we're attracted to the very things that maybe we shouldn't be attracted to. There was another part about that question that I think I lost track of because I was thinking about how we are attracted to narcissists.
The other part of the question was, where along the spectrum does it become a problem, and where along the spectrum is it merely a character trait with positive and negative qualities?
So most character traits have positive and negative qualities, and because I'm not trying to diagnose anyone with a narcissism, I can't really tell you where on that spectrum it becomes a problem. I just know that when people score higher on this, they behave a certain way or report a certain thing than when they're lower on those kinds of things. And very often, in the parts that I find really interesting, is when they deviate from what the rest of us want, right? So most people, when they're looking for a relationship, they're looking for love. They're looking for intimacy and closeness and support, right? And not only to get it, but to give it. Narcissists are looking for attention, admiration, status, right? And so you see this deviation between the goals in terms of what people want from their relationships to begin with. So that person who's looking for status is really charming and fun and, is kind of getting it through their relationships. But most of us, that's not what we want. So I don't know where, I can't tell you where on the continuum that is. Simply that people who score higher are more likely to say, I want an admiring partner over a loving partner.
That's
Interesting.
super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. There's been a few questions, I think, coming from the chat that speak to this. Fred was one of them. Are narcissists born this way, or do they develop? And then if they're developed, then what happened to them along the way that may be contributing to this behavior?
So what a recent research has shown that there is this small genetic component. And you do see these patterns that, narcissistic parents are raising narcissistic children. But that's twofold, right? Part of it's the gene thing, but then part of it is their parenting practices. And to be completely honest, this gets really, really complicated in terms of parenting practices. So I might a little bit oversimplify here. One of the features of parenting is permissive parenting, right? Which is that I am loving towards my child, but I also think they can do no wrong, right? And so there's no boundaries. The kid can do whatever they want, right? And so that's more likely to be associated with raising a child who's narcissistic. Plus, I'm modeling it, right? In some ways, like I'm narcissistic myself, and so my kid sees that as they're growing up. But then there's other things too, like there's words out there like overparenting or maybe helicopter parenting, and then there's like bulldozing and all those kinds of things. And that also gets in the way because it actually creates a situation where the child doesn't actually feel like they can fend for themselves. And so that is also disruptive to their development when they don't learn appropriate boundaries because they always have their parents stepping in for them.
Again, completely hypothetically, and completely just pulling it out. I think I have read that they can also neglect their children, like the children are kind of just in the way of their grandiose goals. I've also read, and again, this is just a hobby interest of mine over the years that I've, for unknown reasons. I've also read that there's a dynamic where there's a favorite child and a reviled child, where they're sort of projecting onto the one child all the things that they believe in, and then this sort of inherent or sort of covered over shame that they don't want to, about their failures and things that they don't want to deal with. Because I think narcissists, there's an insecurity there. You correct me if I'm wrong about that. Maybe there's not, but that they can project on one of the other children, like all the things that they kind of intuitively don't like about themselves. But I don't know if that's just mumbo jumbo.
Okay, so in terms of whether or not narcissists have insecurities, depends on the kind of narcissism we're talking about. So there are some forms of narcissism where they are insecure. The kind we've been talking about all along, they're not insecure. They feel great about themselves. They truly feel great about themselves. You asked about being more neglectful, and that's going to be one of those places where it's really complicated. I mean, so maybe, if my parents are neglecting and I have to fend for myself, I then need the admiration, from external forces because I haven't gotten that kind of love from my parents. But I can also see a situation where I'm not developing narcissism because my parents treated me so poorly. Right. So instead I'm worthless, which again can feed into other kinds of narcissism, but I feel like it's just really complicated and a little bit too easy to say that would be the outcome.
So I'm sitting here wondering if I've ever actually met a narcissist.
Oh, you have. You work with one. We established that at the beginning of the show.
I know. I have a hard time believing that he's a narcissist. Only because from what I had understood prior to this conversation, experiences with narcissists can be really, really bad. And I've now known Ben for a few years, and he's not done anything that I would say, is like bad. That's only feeding his narcissism.
Lulling you into a false sense of security.
Long con game.
I am a long con operator. I'm coming for your life savings next week, and you'll never see it coming.
Well, I think somebody did, but we're not going to talk about that today on this show. Anyway, so I'm curious then, if I'm feeling like I've got such blinders, how would I even know? Like, what kind of signs might there be that I'm dealing with a person who's a narcissist? Are there signs?
So my first sign is like that really charming person. I know like that sounds weird, but I'm a little hesitant. If someone's like super charming, when I first meet them, I'm like, oh no. And of course, not every charming person is a narcissist, but I will say that I am a little bit guarded when I meet people who are extremely charming. Not like I said, they could also just be really extroverted, really kind people. But I want to know more before I get too involved. But other things like the chronic self-promotion, the chronic need for attention, always needing to be the one who's right. Basically acts like they're better than everybody else. Uh-oh, did you just point to yourself?
There's some uncomfortable characteristics here, yes.
Oh no. Okay, so Ben's the one working with a narcissist. Is that what we're That's what we're establishing.
I'm
Okay.
feeling very
I
seen
just wanna-
right now, and not in a good way.
I just want to say that my internet blinked out for a second, and I did not hear whatever Alicia said that made everybody burst out laughing.
It was nonverbal. She pointed to herself. Yeah.
Always having to be right bit. That is like,
Oh yeah, Alicia thinks everybody else is wrong all the time, but that's okay. Most of the time she's right about that.
Oh, okay.
That's called being wise.
sorry, Amy, I would totally.
No, you're fine.
I'm just I want to know if when I meet one. Okay, so
See
they always have to
yesterday's
be
story.
right.
See yesterday's story about how Alicia and I met. I was, I think, the only person in the room at that conference who did not feel like Alicia was saying to them, everything you've represented for the last 5 years has been under-theorized and most of it's wrong. And I thought that was an awesome, awesome thing. And she did it in this very charming way. But here's the thing, I didn't take it as narcissistic at all, because it was in no sense was she asking for validation. And she was just being the skunk at the garden party. And by the way, she was right, and none of it was about her. It was all about the fact that the field was messed up. And so I didn't, just to be clear, I did not take that as evidence. I took that as a valid and rip-roaringly searing critique of an entire field to the people who were responsible for that field. Alicia didn't make any of it about her.
Needless to say, I don't work for an institution that Dale Carnegie set up.
So let's dig in here a little bit. What happens when Alicia is wrong? Because, you guys are all agreeing that she's right and she's always right. Alicia, what happens if you are wrong? So, that I think is more of a sign of how a narcissist would behave, right? Because, I'm an expert and I would like to believe that I'm right when people are asking me about my expertise, and maybe I am. How do I behave when someone corrects me? Am I a complete jerk, right? Or am I receptive to the feedback that I've made a mistake?
Okay, first is like, do I think I'm right or wrong? If I think I'm right, I might keep arguing. However, if I do find out that I'm wrong, then I'm just mortified and embarrassed, and I will then self-flagellate about it for the rest of my life.
Okay.
I know where I am. I know what my clinical diagnosis is.
Yeah, so like if somebody said that something you did hurt them, right? You like that, something really intimate like that. You did this or you said this thing and it hurt me, right? Do I say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry I hurt you, right? And really think about it. Or do I say, you're too sensitive?
I'd be
Right?
mortified.
Right? Yeah. I
So
mean, so
a
it's kind of,
narcissist is going to be like, this is on you.
yes,
I've
yes.
sometimes they say you're being ridiculous. That's a
Mm-hmm.
line that, again, hypothetically, one might hear.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, very often the shift is on you, right? So, I mean, like, I'm not asking if the person's factually correct. It's more like when you get into these dynamics, how do they behave? Do they do they behave in this antagonistic, defensive way, right? Or are they receptive to the feedback that they're getting? Um,
This brings me to an interesting diagnostic question. What are the diagnostics for this? So when you say there's a spectrum, what are the tests that we're using to measure where somebody is on this spectrum? So if we actually wanted to subject Alicia and Holly and me to the narcissism tests, what would those tests look like?
Okay, there is a diagnostic and statistical manual, and I mean, I have the criteria, but I don't have it open in front of me. But if you go to the diagnostic and statistical manual and you look up narcissistic personality disorder, it'll give you a whole set of criteria. And very often when there's diagnosis, you have to meet a certain number of them, right? Um, and again, by a licensed professional, you shouldn't be necessarily self-diagnosing, but you can at least look and find what it says. And I'm pretty sure you can find it online as well. But basically, it'll talk about things like the need for excessive admiration, the sense of grandiose self, and then it gets more detailed from there.
But when you do your research, which, as you describe it, is not clinical in nature, you're looking at where people fit on a spectrum. How are you using clinical definitions for that purpose, or are you using some other way of measuring narcissism?
Okay. So originally narcissism, you're getting a history question now, but answer now. But so basically it
As
started
long
as
as the
a,
history is all about me.
okay. So it started as a diagnosis, right? Narcissistic personality disorder. And researchers, personality and social psychologists started looking at those definitions and they said, okay, well, we know that there's this extreme level, but these things that are in that definition, right, in the criteria for diagnosis, to some extent, they're represented in all of us. And so they created an inventory that assesses what we call subclinical or normal narcissism, right? In other words, we're not looking to diagnose people. And so there's a whole lot of different kinds of measurements now that look at narcissism. And so I basically give a questionnaire and I score that questionnaire based on what people say. And so when I'm doing my research, I'm looking at who scored higher on this questionnaire of narcissism compared to people who scored lower. That's why it's also not diagnostic, right? Because there's no like cutoff.
Right. So it's more like it's more like a kind of MMPI sort of um uh like descriptive, but it's not trying to isolate specific people's diagnoses.
Right, right. And so this also means, right, so my samples, like the mean in the sample can be different, right? So sometimes I study college kids and, they might be a little bit higher on narcissism. And then I might study people who are older, usually because I recruited them online, and they tend to be a little bit lower on narcissism. But I can still compare people who are higher or lower within my sample.
So
Yeah.
I've got a follow-on question on this one. Okay. Young, I'm saying this from experience. When you're young, you're a child, and you're not really aware of the world, you do tend to be a lot more self-centered. The world revolves around you. Are younger people then more like a tendency to be narcissistic on the scale, and that they may outgrow it over time?
So, I mean, there's some controversy in terms of the question about age, because there's some people who argue that the younger generations are more narcissistic than the older generations. And they go back and forth and back and forth. And to be honest, I'm not sure about that. But there's also evidence that as we get older, we become a little bit less narcissistic, right? So like the world revolves around me when I'm 15. right? Like that starts to change a little bit and then it stabilizes. So a lot of our personality traits tend to stabilize as we reach adulthood. So there's lots of changes that are happening in adolescence. So little kids tend not to be narcissistic. I mean, not impossible, but they tend not to be. And also because our needs as children changes as we're getting older. But, in terms of being like more self-centered, you think of your teenager as being self-centered, right? And they'll grow out of that and then it'll stabilize. And so some of us stabilize at a higher level
One
at
hopes.
narcissism, and some of us stabilize at a lower level of narcissism.
There is another question from, oh, sorry, Ben.
No, I was just going to say, so is it always wrong to talk about a teenager as narcissistic because teenagers aren't, they're, they're not, they're organically and necessarily and age appropriately narcissistic, or is there some condition that is narcissistic even for a 15-year-old?
Right. So there are scales that assess narcissism in children and in adolescents. I guess I would err on the side of not calling a child narcissistic, even if it's like what you mean. I would probably like point out like you're being a little bit self-centered, or you're not really thinking about other people, or how other people are feeling, simply because of that label, right? If I keep saying I have a teenager, and if I kept saying to him like narcissism, 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 I don't want him to think, well, then I am a narcissist, right? So kind of like the same thing where you wouldn't want to keep calling your kid stupid, right? Because you don't want your kid to grow up thinking they're stupid. I guess like for me, and this is just my own personal opinion rather than necessarily a professional one, I would want to work with my kid on, perspective taking and empathy rather than labeling them as something quote bad. If I'm talking about teenagers in general, teenagers tend to be pretty self-centered and self-absorbed. Yeah.
Ben, you seem like you're going to ask something. If you're not, I've
No, no,
got
no. It's referring to you.
it. Okay. So another question, I'm pretty sure Fred had it in the chat. Is there a skewing among the genders of who is more narcissistic?
Ah, yes. Men. I can tell you that like with so men are more narcissistic. There was a debate for a little while because it did seem to be that it was starting to even out, but there was a meta-analysis that was done a few years back and it showed that men are more narcissistic than women. But I don't want to make it like an extreme thing. It's not whopping, but it's there. It's reliable. They are reliably, statistically more narcissistic than women are.
That's because their mothers are always doting on them and the teachers are always saying how smart they are.
Well, I'm actually curious. Is there evidence whether society is more tolerant of it in men, or what, or is it really that society favors it up to a point and then disfavors it, and it's just a behavior that more men exhibit than women?
I agree that we tolerate certain aspects in men or even see them as positive, right? We want them in men and those same characteristics we don't want in women. Assertiveness, for example, right? So if a man is assertive, he's assertive. If a woman is assertive, she's aggressive, right? So I think a lot of it is about our stereotypes about men and women, and we want to see men as more, agentic or like, accept dominance and things like that more in men than we do in women. So yeah, I think some of it is sort of that, gender stereotyping that happens in the lifespan.
So I think one before we go, there was some other questions, and this was from Fred. Is there anything that an average person can do in the face of a narcissist? Like, are there any? I mean, this might be beyond the scope of your research, but just curious, like, how can we cope with them? Can they be mitigated?
Yeah. So, okay. So first, are you summarizing somebody? Hey, I met you and you're narcissistic. And we're pretty good at this, by the way. We don't necessarily trust our gut, but this is one of those places where you should trust your gut. You're probably right. So first, like, if you want to get involved, like trusting that gut thing. But if you're already in a relationship with somebody who is narcissistic, then I would say, and it depends on the kind of relationship we're talking about, a lot of times, like, you'll get advice to get out of the relationship, and it's not always that easy. If you're married to someone for 10 years and you share your finances and you have 3 kids, right? It's not easy to just be like, okay, I'm out of here. So I would say that you need to figure out what your boundaries are. This is easier, I think, in a workplace situation, where you can figure out what your boundaries are, how long you're going to spend in maybe talking to somebody. Um, Again, I don't think that this is easy, but I think figuring out like your own boundaries is really, really helpful. And I also think you need to figure out what works with the person that you're dealing with. And I hate to suggest that we become manipulative ourselves, but it's almost like a survival tactic, right? That if I can get what I need from my boss, if I tell him how appreciative I am of him or her, right, then I might actually get from that conversation what I need. And so I think that there's part of like it reading what that person needs. In terms of a romantic relationship, you're married to a narcissist. My best advice is to go to counseling. The counselor will work with you on strategies for coping. And in terms of whether narcissists can change, I think that may have come up earlier. There are there's some research that suggests that they can, like especially in this relationship lens. It's simply that it's preliminary. We don't know how long these interventions last. So if you work with empathy, you work with perspective taking, if you remind the person that they're cared for and loved, there is some suggestion that they can become better romantic partners. But we know that in like a lab situation, does it last a year later, or do they need this chronic, intervention over time? I do believe with that kind of intervention, if the person's receptive to change, that they have a problem and they need to change. I do have hope in those kinds of situations.
Okay, I want to leave us. We have with the last question, and I want to bring it back to our bullies conversation from the other day. I have a personal habit with the narcissists in my life, which is never to give them validation of any kind. And that tends to make them super uncomfortable around me. I'm perfectly pleasant. I don't, but I don't validate the self-centeredness ever. And I consider it very similar to what our guest the other day was saying about bullies, which is you have to stand up to them. Um, and so my question is the don't negotiate with terrorists theory of dealing with the pathology in pathological people in your life applicable to narcissists as well as bullies, or am I just kidding myself? And I should be being very strategic about when to validate them, when to affirm them, when to kind of give them what they want. My view is, excuse me, fuck them. You want this validation from me. You're not getting it. You're going to have to deal with me like a regular person. Seems to knock them off guard in a pretty systematic way. But, my N is really low in this sample.
Well, I guess I need to know what is the relationship, right? Because if, like, let's say the narcissist in question is my brother, I'm with you completely. I probably behave the same way, right? But my brother has no power over me, but my boss does. And to some extent, there's that close interdependence with my husband, right? So I think it's really important to acknowledge who the player is. Because if it's my boss and I want to get something from my boss, I'm going to be better off figuring out how to play the game. But right, but if it's a colleague who's like, lateral, right? I don't need to validate you.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
very good point. All of the
Mhm.
people I am visualizing right now are people who are lateral to me socially or below me on the power totem pole. Um, in the nature of our relationships, there's nobody I need anything from other than a less friction laden existence as opposed to a more friction laden resistance.
Right.
Well, that on that front, like I don't know, I found that sometimes playing into the like flattering. I mean, again, if you're just trying to get through Thanksgiving dinner, like, and you don't want to like,
Silence and a cold stare.
yeah, I don't know, some flattery gets
No,
you out of some
not
jam.
doing it. Not doing it.
Okay, well, that's
Silence
you.
and a
I'm very
cold
conflict
stare.
averse, so I don't want to. It depends on the situation, what you actually like. Do I want the relationship to improve, or do I think it can improve? Like that's different from like this relationship. It's never changing. The people are never changing, but how do I sort of get through the interaction? I don't
Well,
like flatter them excessively, but I don't challenge their grandiosity.
well,
Um,
one thing that I do is cut them off mercilessly at 9 o'clock because we have a hard stop at
that
nine
works.
o'clock, and it works. You see, um, look, uh, we're going to be back tomorrow. Oh, no, not tomorrow, on Monday. Amy, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all for having this conversation about me and focusing and merely being expressions of my uh, uh, in interactions with theoretical other beings. Um, this has been, no, jokes aside, super interesting. Really appreciate your joining us. And we're going to be back next week, and it's going to be fun because remember, we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to make large numbers of people in a hotel lobby listen to our conversations and pretend like that's a normal thing to do. See you guys later.
Bye.